In this video, we're going in depth with the XTool F1. And if you guys aren't already familiar with the F1, it's a very versatile high-speed laser cutter and engraver. And what makes it so versatile is its portable size, as well as the fact that it packs two different types of lasers in one machine. So it's got a blue 10-watt diode laser, as well as a 2-watt infrared laser. And this makes it possible to process a ton of different materials with this single machine. Plus, it uses galvanometer technology to enable that high-speed engraving. So unlike some of the more common machines on the market right now that you've probably seen, which have a laser module mounted on a gantry-style motion system, the galvanometer allows it to engrave at very high speeds because it's not moving around that very heavy laser module. Another awesome thing about the F1 is that technically it's a fully enclosed machine with this lid that closes on the front. And that makes smoke and fume management and containment a whole lot easier, especially if you get their smoke and fume purifier, which they also sent me here. Now these two units, you can get them bundled together in one package from XTool. I'll put a link to that down in the video description below. Otherwise, if you're not interested in the smoke and fume purifier, you can get the F1 also on its own. And so whether you already own an F1 or you're just in the market for one, this video has got something for everybody. I'm gonna be walking you guys through the unboxing, the assembly, as well as a whole bunch of different use cases for the XTool F1. And for each of those examples, I'm gonna be sharing with you guys my material and machine settings to get you guys started quicker. I also have a bunch of different attachments, templates, and more that I've developed for the XTool F1, and I'm gonna make those available on my website, embracemaking.com, so keep watching for those. And before we go any further, I just wanna point out that the F1 is intended to be run with this front cover completely closed, and that is of course to protect your eyes. What you will find in this video is that I often operate it with the cover open, and this was a personal risk that I took in order to get awesome video footage of the engraving process for you guys. Now, I would not recommend that you do this. However, it didn't matter if I had the cover open or even if I had the cover closed. What I was doing to protect my eyes was wearing a pair of good solid laser safety glasses. And these exact ones here are the ones that I was wearing while I was making this video. And I've made these exact glasses available on my website, embracemaking.com. And what's awesome about these ones is that they are rated to protect your eyes from both blue and infrared laser in a single pair of glasses. And so that makes them especially suitable for use with the F1. And of course, if you purchase these glasses from my website, you're helping to support my channel and my work. Plus, you're getting something useful and of value in return, in addition to, of course, this video, which I've provided to you guys for free. And one final note on safety is that laser cutting and engraving can be more than just harmful to your eyes. There are other health risks involved, especially if you're vaporizing the wrong material. Certain materials can release toxic gases that can be very dangerous in small amounts. And just because you have an enclosure or a smoke and fume purifier, those trace amounts can still hurt you and harm you, whether it's in the short term or the long run. And neither of the enclosure or the smoke and fume purifier is 100% effective in capturing and filtering those particles. One really bad material that you want to try and avoid is PVC, and there's a few others as well. So I'm going to put a link in the video description down below that will take you to a website that describes some materials that are safe and some that are dangerous for laser cutting and engraving. And now with all of that said, I just want to send a big thank you out to XTool for generously sending me the F1 as well as the smoke and fume purifier. Without them, this video would not be possible. Let's get started. We'll start with the unboxing, and as with all XTool products, the F1 looks very nicely packaged and the presentation of the box is excellent. At the very top, you're presented with the user manual, and under a thick layer of foam, you'll find the F1 along with all of the included accessories. And because the F1 is intended to be portable, you can pull it up directly straight out of the box, and it's very manageable in size and weight. In the various boxes, you'll find an exhaust hose, an extra USB lockout key, some lubricant. You'll also find a very complete and extensive material sample pack. In the same box, you'll find this ribbed aluminum plate, which is intended to support materials while making through cuts. We'll get to that later. You'll find the power supply to power the F1, and you'll find the other end of the power supply cord to plug into the wall, as well as the USB cable to plug into your computer. All of these items are depicted and described in the nice quality user manual. XTool also generously sent me their desktop smoke purifier. Now you can buy these smoke purifiers separately from the F1, or you can buy them together as a bundled package. I'll put a link to both options in the video description down below. In the top of the smoke purifier box, you'll find its respective user manual as well as its own power supply. And this unit is slightly dimensionally larger than the F1, but it's quite light, so it's also very manageable to take out of the package, and it's a nice polished looking product in my opinion. It comes with some extra pre-filter material. Later in the video, I'll show you guys how to swap that out. And in the box, you get the power supply cords, as well as the couplers and exhaust hoses that you'll need to hook this thing up to the F1. Since we were just looking at the smoke purifier, the only real assembly here with the F1 is hooking these two units up if you purchase them together. And so the smoke purifier has two settings. One is the constant running mode, and the other one is what they call the united mode, basically the synced mode between the F1 and the smoke purifier. And so on the back, you can see there's two exhaust ports. One of them is an inlet at the top, the one at the bottom is the outlet. There's a switch on the far right hand side to switch the power from high, medium, and low settings. On the left side, you have the power supply port as well as two USB ports. The one USB-C connector here will go into the one on the right-hand side, and it's labeled F1. And the other end of the USB-C cable, which is included with the smoke purifier, will go into the smoke purifier USB-C connector on the back of the F1. Then you can take one of your exhaust hoses, slip it over the inlet at the back of the smoke purifier and the outlet at the back of the F1, and those are just press fits. Then you can lift the green cover on the F1 and remove the lens cap, plug the USB cable into the side of the F1 with the little depiction of a computer monitor, and then plug the other end of the USB cable into your laptop or computer, power on both units, and wait for them to make some very loud beeping noises. Eventually you'll see that the smoke purifier indicator lights switch from the continuous mode to the synced mode once the F1 and the smoke purifier are done syncing up. And on the F1, you should notice a red and blue laser dot, which may or may not be overlapping at this point. These will aid in focusing the laser, which we'll touch on in a second. So now for the setup, you're going to want to launch the XTool Creative Space, and you're going to want to click Connect Device in the top right hand corner. And it should detect the F1 if you've connected it to your computer and it's powered on. You may get a firmware update prompt, and I would highly recommend that you agree to update the firmware. You'll get this message and it will stick around on your screen for quite some time. The firmware update does take several minutes, so be patient. Wait for the entire thing to complete and don't power down the module while it's updating. On the right hand side, you'll see a little message that says use autofocus before initializing. Click on that, and this is going to autofocus your XTool F1. Make sure the workspace is empty while you're doing this, because you'll see that the laser head will move up and down and you don't want it crashing into anything. The laser should now be focused on the bottom plate, which is the 0 position, and the red and blue laser dots will overlap. Now I'm going to insert this 2mm thick piece of basswood, and so over on the right hand side, once the autofocus is done, you'll see a prompt come up saying thickness. I'm going to type in 2, I'm going to hit enter, and the module will move up to now set the laser focus on the top surface of that 2mm thick object. Alternatively, you can use the manual focus knob on the side, and if you turn it clockwise, that's going to move the unit up. You'll see the red laser dot move to the left of the blue dot, and if you turn the manual focus knob counterclockwise to the left, the red laser dot will move to the right, back in focus, in line with the blue dot. In XTool Creative Space, we're going to set up a very simple job. So I've just imported a regular raster image and resized it into the workspace. So this is just a grayscale PNG file. On the right hand side, you can see I've got it on laser flat. I've pre-selected the material as 3mm basswood, but since this is 2mm thick, I changed the thickness back to 2mm. Hit enter and the autofocus will take care of the rest. And then in all of the settings, I'm not going to touch anything for the first job. These are all of the XTool reference settings. Down in the framing section, you can see that if you press the framing button, You'll get a blue laser light show on your workpiece depicting where your graphic will be engraved. And this is obviously very useful for aligning your workpiece. Then in the bottom right hand corner, we can click Process. You'll get a preview of the job. You'll click Start. And then on the side of the machine, the focus knob will flash blue and you can just press it in and the job will start. Unlike the large work area laser cutters and engravers, such as the XTool D1 Pro, you'll see that there are no visible moving parts on the XTool F1. In the XTool reference settings for basswood, you may have noticed that it had the blue laser selected because the F1 has both an infrared and blue laser. And here you can see the blue laser very quickly scanning back and forth to produce the engraved image on the top of that 2mm basswood. And for reference, this job took about 3 minutes. And once it's done, you can open up the F1 and you'll see here that the reference settings are a little bit off in my opinion. Now, to be fair, wood can be a little funny to work with at times because of how the different colors and grain of wood absorbs the laser. Now on the back side here, this is the exact same job that was done on the XTool D1 Pro 40 watt, which I featured in a previous video. And that's the darkness and range of engraving that we're shooting for. I repeated this job a few times with different settings, and the ones that I had settled on was I changed the dot duration to 700 microseconds. And basically the dot duration is how long the laser is remaining in one spot, so a single dot, at 80% power. Because you can also play with the power and you can play with the dots per inch, but in this case I only changed the dot duration. And you can see that we're getting a much better result, and in my opinion, after doing this 4 or 5 times, 700 microseconds on this basswood was optimum. Your results may vary, but this gives you a pretty good starting point, and you can see again that I'm getting a nice range from 0 to 100%. And with all the lasers I've tested so far, the area between 65 to 85% always seems to be a little difficult to discern between those regions. And you can see on the bottom card there, I was just quickly showing the exact same thing at 720 microseconds, where you get a little bit more charring. And so I flipped it back here to the 700 microseconds, and I was happy with that result. Don't be afraid to venture outside of the reference settings to find the sweet spot for your material and your graphic. Now that we have the basics established, we can move on to lasering more objects and materials like these purple metal business cards from XTool. And you can get these on their website in a variety of different colors. You get a few of these in the sample pack that comes with the F1. And so I picked the purple ones because I think they look pretty sharp. And you'll find the purple metal business card in the XTool reference material settings. The reference settings will automatically update the thickness field, but you will want to hop in there and just press enter to make sure that the laser autofocuses at 0.2 millimeters, and then we can go ahead and frame our design. And in this case, I just have a business card size PNG file, which is black and transparent with the YouTube logo as well as a QR code, which would take you to my YouTube channel. I'm going to run this job, and I made 0 changes at first to the XTool reference settings, and right away you can see that there are some issues and the quality here is not perfect. Most notably, you can see this blotchy area in the YouTube logo. I'm not entirely sure what would have caused that. Could just be a defect in the material, but you can also see some scan lines in the solid area of the YouTube logo, but otherwise the fine details came out okay, so I don't think the reference settings are far off. And while we're looking at these metal business cards, one thing I want to point out and show you as a comparison is this red card that I had done with the XTool D1 Pro, so a totally different XTool machine, and this was the 40 watt. And you'll see that the YouTube logo in this case has some fading, and even the QR code has some fading on the edges. And on those machines, the power of the laser module has to be modulated properly so that as the head speeds up and slows down at the edges of the graphics, the power is properly maintained. Now there are ways to address that on the D1, and I did fix that in that video, but the whole reason I want to point this out is that you won't have that kind of problem on the F1. But instead on the F1, we did have a different issue where there were some fine lines that seemed to be missing on the YouTube logo, so my intuition tells me to increase the power slightly, and I'm also going to increase the dots per inch. By increasing the power and the dots per inch, I'm hoping that I get a slightly denser scan. This should address those missing lines, and if I'm correct, it won't result in any loss of detail and hopefully no bleeding of the graphic. The final result is that these settings made a huge improvement. The YouTube logo is completely filled, and if you look very closely at my Embrace Making logo in the middle of the QR code, the fine lines are still there, so there's no bleeding of that graphic. Flipping the card over to the original XTool reference settings, you can see that my settings are a much better starting point for you. Looking at the good side again, one other thing that we need to address though is the alignment of the graphic on these business cards, and I have a solution for that. When aligning objects on the XTool F1, you place your workpiece in the work area, and then oftentimes you're using the framing to get the thing aligned. Now XTool does give you this bracket here, and it has thumb screws which will screw into the holes in the work area. And this allows you to easily square up rectangular workpieces or jigs with respect to the machine. And it's really nice that XTool has provided you with this accessory to line up your workpiece on the machine. However, in the Creative Space software, there doesn't seem to be any reference to this alignment system on the work area. The faint grid lines that you can see in the software workspace are spaced out by 10 millimeters, and this has zero relevance or reference to the fixturing system. And so even though I have my business card nicely positioned in the physical space, when I go to put my graphic down here, I'm basically placing it blind. I have no idea where the business card actually is. To fix this, I made a graphic that you can download on my website. I'll put a link in the video description down below. You can import it into your workspace. You'll want to select no, just display it in the original size. It should automatically center itself inside of your workspace. And now you can see that you have a representation of the fixturing system. You'll see all of the holes, and you'll see some dashed lines which correspond with where that angled bracket will fall on your workspace. And we want this image to just be a background, so on the right hand side with the image selected, click on Ignore instead of Output. And now XTool Creative Space will not include this image with your next laser job. Now I've brought back in the business card graphic, and despite it being a transparent image, the overall size of the image is the same size as the business card, and so the corner represents the corner of the business card. I'm going to line up the top left corner of my graphic with the dotted lines that are corresponding with the current position that I have that angled bracket installed in. And if you guys aren't aware, with the image selected, you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard to nudge the graphic in very small 0.1 millimeter increments to get it perfectly aligned. Now, because we're using a black business card, I'm going to check out the black metal business card settings, and the first thing I notice is that the thickness is different, which is a little odd. So I'm going to change it back to 0.2 millimeters. Now, when I go into the rest of the settings, I also notice that XTool has the black business card set to using the blue diode laser instead of the infrared, and all of these other settings are pretty drastically different. This seems very odd to me, so I'm going to switch back to the purple business card. I'm going to put my original settings back in there, and we're going to see how this works out. And I just want to point this out to you guys because I would recommend not just blindly trusting the reference settings, even though they're coming directly from XTool. I've pressed the framing button, and you can see that the graphic is now lined up with the business card, and it was relatively easy to do. However, I have an even easier method, so keep watching for that. And the significance of this is that it should increase the efficiency of your workflow, and this is a big deal if you're running a business. Time is money. And so we're going to process this job, and again, we're using those purple business card settings that I had showed you earlier, and they seem to be working very well on the black business card. However, I unfortunately experienced a power outage in the middle of that job, and so I reprocessed it on another black business card with a slightly different business card design, but you get the idea. The quality on the black business card is identical to the purple using the same settings. It's also worth noting that the position of the graphic looks good using that alignment template that I made available for download on my website. However, keep watching because I have an even easier and faster solution in the next section of this video. This time we're going to line a slightly bigger object, and we're going to be using one of these aluminum wallets, and we're going to be aligning it using the bottom right hand corner. You can see now that I've moved the alignment bracket to the bottom right hand corner, and the thumb screw on the right hand side is in one of the holes that is outside of the work area. Therefore, in this case, when we go to align our graphic, we're going to take the right edge of our graphic and we're going to align it with the bold edge of the outline that represents the plate that can be removed from the bottom of the XTool F1. And for these aluminum wallets that I believe are anodized, we're going to use the exact same engraving settings as we did for the business cards. After changing those settings, don't forget we also have to change the material thickness. And so I've measured these wallets to be 9.2 millimeters thick. Now we can go ahead and process this job, and these settings should be suitable for this black anodized aluminum wallet. During the engraving, I could tell that these settings were spot on, and the one side of the wallet took nearly 16 minutes to finish. And this is quite a busy and intricate pattern, so I wasn't really surprised that it took that long. In the end, I thought this pattern and design looked really cool. The contrast between the black and the silver is super sharp. The entire job turned out flawless, and the alignment was also perfect. And if I was running production on these wallets, I could simply flip it over, load up the next file. I could even type in the exact coordinates for precise repeatability, or perhaps save that second backside design as its own creative space file and just load it up and press process. Not surprisingly, the backside turned out just as nice as the front. You can see that it's a slightly different design without the logo. And if you look at the side edges of the wallet, the design somewhat wraps around. It's not obviously all the way around to the sides, but enough that it covers those radiused edges and it looks interesting. And because these wallets come in a very affordable 2-pack, I'll put a link to them in the video description down below. The second silver anodized wallet I processed again with the exact same settings, just with a slightly different design. The engraved portion of the design is more of a light and flat colored silver than the coated section, and so again you get a very nice contrast between the two, and the design looks sharp overall. Similar to the first wallet, the backside is just the same pattern but without the logo. When designing this pattern, I tried to make it such that if the pattern could wrap around those edges, it would be continuous around the entire wallet. Now obviously the edges didn't get lasered, but if I could, it looks like they would have lined up perfect. There is another way to increase efficiency and repeatability, and that's with the use of fixtures like this one. This is my 9-in-1 multi-jig fixture, and as the name would suggest, it accommodates 9 different objects of different sizes and shapes, including the XTool metallic business cards. It has its own creative space template that you can import and then just hit ignore so it doesn't get processed with your graphic. You'll see that the template has numbers on it, and those numbers, such as -1.5 millimeters in the metal card area, are the offsets from the 0 plane. And the 0 plane is the top surface of the XTool F1 workspace. So when you hit autofocus, this is where the XTool F1 sets the focus to 0. Therefore, to get our focus distance for the metal business card, it's as simple as adding the two numbers together. So you add -1.5 plus the thickness of the metal business card, which is 0.2, and the result is -1.3. I'll show you guys that in a second, and I'll take you through another example so it's very clear. But in the meantime, I've brought in the business card graphic, and you can see I've placed it right over the area which was labeled metal business card. Earlier in the video, we already processed a bunch of these business cards, so we're already aware of the settings that we're going to be using for this graphic. And now we're ready to enter the thickness after initializing the autofocus. And so the thickness field starts with 0. And again, we're going to perform our calculation. So the business card is sitting on the area with an offset of -1.5. So it's just -1.5 plus the thickness of the business card, which is 0.2. And we're going to enter in -1.3. With the fixture and the template, we've now reduced our setup time to seconds. And the result is a perfectly centered graphic, and the focus is bang on as well. If you wanted to process the backside or do another card, you could throw another one in there, or if you wanted to switch to another material, you can quickly switch over to something else, like one of those aluminum wallets, or in this case, I'm going to switch over to this pendant necklace, which is also an XTool material. XTool sells these necklaces in gold, rose gold, and silver colors. This one here is the rose gold color, and you can see that I have a place for it in my multi-jig, and the offset for this is -4.5 millimeters. So I'll drag my graphic over into the pendant zone. It's 5 millimeters thick, and so the calculation is -4.5 millimeters plus 5 millimeters equals +0.5 millimeters. And so +0.5 millimeters is what I'll enter into the thickness field. These pendants are very small and we want to use the IR laser. So in the F1 settings, we're going to click on infrared laser preheat. This will preheat the laser for 10 seconds before the job starts, and this is going to give us more consistent results. This job will only take a few seconds at most, and so without preheating, that IR laser may never even reach the proper temperature. So that's why we're using the preheat. As for the settings, we're going to use the dot duration of 200 microseconds, power at 55%, and the DPI at 550. I found these settings to give the best results with the rose gold and gold colored pendants. However, I did not try it on the silver colored pendants, so your results may vary with those ones. Either way, I think it's a pretty good starting point for you guys, and this is the result on the rose gold pendant. The pendant has been clearly marked and the text is very sharp with no bleeding around the edges. And as I just mentioned, I used the exact same settings on the gold colored pendants, and those turned out equally as nice. Now on this one here, I processed both sides of the pendant, so it was as simple as just flipping it over, importing a new graphic, and then processing it. And this was done in a few seconds. For circular objects, I've created a very similar fixture, and you can see a series of concentric rings. Now in this video, the fixtures that you're seeing here are the first prototypes, so there are some minor things that I'm going to change and polish up. For example, the text that I was just pointing to right in the center will get cleaned up. So just keep in mind that the production versions will look a lot nicer. And for the first demonstration of this fixture, we're going to be using this round leatherette patch from XTool materials. And so it's got a 3M adhesive backing that is supposed to stick very well to fabrics. And these are laser safe faux leather, so they do not contain any PVC. You do not want to be processing any fake leather that contains PVC. My circular fixture functions in the same way as the previous one that I just showed you, so it has its own XTool Creative Space template, which we're going to import, not scale it, and then tell XTool Creative Space to ignore it. You'll also see that this template has offset values that match the ones printed on the physical part. And in the center, you'll find that there are two numbers. -4.5 millimeters is the absolute center, and -3 millimeters is that next ring, which is just too small to fit the text on. So I put it in the center next to that closest ring, which I think is easy enough to understand. With that explained, now we can bring in the logo that we're going to laser onto that leatherette patch, and I'm going to position it right in the center of the workspace. Once we have our graphics centered, we can use the XTool reference settings for the silver black leather patch. Now this is just a starting point for us because we are going to make changes to these reference settings. As they are right now in Creative Space, you don't really get great results with them. We're also going to set up our thickness. So in this case, the leather patch is sitting on the circle with a 3mm offset, and the patch is 1.5 millimeters thick. So 3mm plus 1.5 millimeters is 4.5 millimeters, and that's what we're putting in the thickness field. For the black silver leather reference settings, first I want to show you that XTool for some reason has the bitmap mode set to grayscale. And so if we were to process this, you'll see that my black and white logo has a bit of a gray background. You could play with the grayscale slider, but why complicate things? I'm just going to switch it over to Jarvis, and this is going to give me the result that I'm looking for. And then you can see I've changed the settings for a dot duration of 100 microseconds, power at 20%, and the DPI at 500. For this particular logo, I'm going for a more muted look. I don't want the logo or the lasered area to be very shiny silver. I want it to be more of a flat black. And with those settings, that's what I was able to achieve. This just gives the patch a more understated look, and at certain angles when the light hits the lasered area, you can see it more clearly. But overall, this is the exact look that I was going for. What's really cool though is that with these leatherette patches, we can get a totally different look. So I'm going to change the dot duration to 150 microseconds, power at 25%, and the DPI still remains at 500. And you can see with this patch here, I've achieved a much shinier silver logo. I personally thought that it was very interesting with some minor changes to those settings. We could achieve two completely different looks on these leatherette patches from XTool. One other thing I want to point out is that with the use of my circular fixturing system, the logos are perfectly centered on those round leather patches. Without the fixture, I would have otherwise had to spend a fair amount of time trying to align a circular object, and the right angle bracket that XTool gives you with the F1 is just not suitable for that. Despite having adhesive backings, I got the patches sewed onto these blank hats that I got from Amazon. I'll put a link to those in the video description down below. By now you'll also have noticed that these are some very recognizable brands, And I just want to say that I am not whatsoever in the business of selling these items. And I would also recommend that you don't sell any items with trademarked or copyrighted logos or any other intellectual property that doesn't belong to you, unless of course you have been legally granted the license to do so. What I am in the business of doing is providing you guys with more useful and interesting tools for your laser cutter and engraver, such as this workpiece clamping device. Now, this one here is a prototype, and at the time of this video release, the final production model is not ready. I've got a bit more work to do, but I want to show you guys one of the early iterations of this design, so that for those of you who are watching further on into the future, you can visit my website, embracemaking.com, and I'll likely have the production model ready. And as you can see, the purpose of this is to be able to clamp and hold in place objects of various size that perhaps do not fit into those jigs or fixtures that I already showed you. Before we move on to the next section of this video, I just want to point out that the through-cut prism plate, when not in use, actually makes a pretty good jig and fixture stand. It's always nice to keep things together and organized. We've looked at a few examples of marking and engraving, but what about through-cuts? Included with the XTool F1 is this through-cut backing plate. It provides an air gap between your workpiece and the solid surface underneath to reduce the amount of burning and charring underneath of the piece that you're cutting through. In this case, we're going to be using this 2mm thick piece of basswood. When performing through cuts on the XTool F1, you're going to want to be able to completely close your lid so that all of the fumes can be captured. The problem you may run into is that the pieces of basswood that you have are likely larger than the XTool F1 workspace area. However, I want to show you how easy and quick it is to resize these sheets, especially the thin 2 or 3mm thick pieces of basswood. And so all you need to do is score the sheet with a razor blade. So in this case, I'm using a box cutter and a regular ruler. Then you can find yourself a nice sharp edge, like the edge of a table, or even in my case here, I'm using this edge of the speed square. Line up the score mark with the edge and then just break it off. And then you have a nice clean sharp edge, and you can very quickly and easily resize these panels to fit inside of the XTool F1. With our panel resized, we can now figure out our autofocus distance. The prism plate, as XTool likes to call it in the user manual, is 19mm thick, and we're going to remember that dimension. The piece of basswood here is 2mm thick, and I'm going to import the vector image in DXF format, which is compatible with XTool Creative Space. This is the pattern we're going to cut, so on the right hand side we're going to select cut. And as for the reference settings, we're going to be using 3mm basswood. I'm going to select that, and although our material is only 2mm, that's okay, because in a moment we're going to be changing the thickness field anyways. As for all of the power settings, we're going to leave them completely the same, and for the thickness, I'm going to change it to 20mm. So you can see here I first entered 21, and that's the 19mm plate plus 2mm thick basswood, but we're going to focus the laser at the center of the basswood. So it's 2mm thick. We're going to focus it 1mm into the wood. So that's why we ended up with a dimension of 20. Focusing at the center of the material rather than the surface is very common for when we're doing through cuts. Another thing to consider is that if you're using the XTool smoke purifier, that you'll want to switch the fan speed to high at the back of the machine when you're performing through cuts. For the through cuts, you may have noticed in the XTool reference settings that the F1 will be using the blue diode laser. This is a 10-watt laser, so your through cuts might have to go a little slower than what you may see on a bigger laser machine like the D1 Pro with a 20 or 40 watt module, and so I've sped up the video here. A through cut will also typically produce more smoke and fumes, and the XTool smoke purifier should take care of all of that, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. With the job complete, you can see that the 10-watt blue diode laser cut pretty effortlessly through the 2mm thick basswood with the 3mm reference settings. One thing I noticed that I want to point out here is that the edges of your cut piece may be slightly beveled. And that's because if you had noticed while the laser was running, the laser beam emanates from the center of the F1, and when the pattern that you're cutting extends out to the outer bounds of the work area, that laser beam is going to have to get shot out at ever more extreme angles. This will produce that angled cut, and if I had a thicker workpiece, the angle would be even more noticeable. Laser machines like the XTool D1 Pro that have the laser module moving on a gantry wouldn't experience this sort of problem because the laser is always perpendicular to the workpiece. And the reason I want to point this out is that if you're producing parts that are intended to interface or fit together, it may take a little bit of experimentation to get those parts just right considering those angles. I went ahead and cut a second piece which has the same outline but also has some inner cuts intended for metal USB sticks. I'll mark the top and bottom of this piece and then we'll glue the two parts together with some wood glue. Since this jig is intended to sit inside of the center hole of the XTool F1, I glued those two pieces and let them set while sitting in that hole so they're guaranteed to fit. And so while that glue is drying, we'll change gears for a minute and we'll talk a little bit more about the smoke purifier from XTool. During all of my tests so far, the XTool smoke purifier seems to work very well. However, if you have a very sensitive nose and you're doing those through cuts, you may want to hook up the exhaust hose. Now the smoke purifier comes with this extra hose and the one end does not have a coupler on it. However, they do supply you with a loose coupler. Attaching the two parts together is fairly straightforward. Inside of the coupler, you have these staggered tabs and they are basically going to thread onto the outside of the flexible hose. The flexible hose kind of reminds me of one of those old plastic bendable drinking straws, and so if you extend the end of it out, you'll find that it looks like a screw thread. And so all you have to do here is take your coupler and you're going to thread it on. However, it's going to thread in the left hand direction, so this is opposite of righty tighty lefty loosey, so you'll be threading it on counterclockwise. It might take you one or two tries to properly catch the thread, and even once you catch the first thread, you might have to do a little more wiggling around before you can fully seat the coupler. Once it's fully threaded on, I like to compress the end of the hose, and something in my head tells me this might prevent it from coming back off. Before we push the hose on, just a reminder, the top is the inlet and the bottom port is the outlet, and so we're going to be connecting this to the bottom port so that we can handle the exhaust coming out of the smoke purifier. And just like the port on the back of the F1, the hose just pushes on and it's a friction fit. Now, even when extended, this hose here is only a few feet long at maximum. And so you may not have a window or door that close nearby where you can route it outside. So you're going to need to adapt this hose to something longer. And what I have here is a XTool hose to 4-inch hose adapter. And just like with the fixtures that I showed you earlier, these adapters are available on my website, embracemaking.com. And you can see that the one side just friction fits into the XTool hose. The other side is made for a fairly standard 4-inch dryer duct style hose. And you can see here I have one with a hose clamp. So I can slip that over the end of the adapter and then I can tighten it down with the hose clamp. These 4-inch hoses and hose clamps can be found at your local hardware store and they're very inexpensive. Additionally, the 4-inch hoses are sold in very long lengths, so you'll have no issue finding the length you need to get that exhaust to a door or a window. If you have a very long run of hose, you may want to consider using an inline duct fan. I have one installed on my basement window here, and it's helping to pull the smoke and fumes through that long run of hose, and that's because the small fan inside of the XTool smoke purifier may not produce enough pressure to push the fumes through that length of hose. I'll put some links in the video description down below where you can find these inline duct fans, and just remember here that you do not absolutely need to do this. This is optional as the air coming out of the smoke purifier exhaust has already been filtered. Now, how well it's been filtered, that's hard for me to say, and I think it's largely going to depend on the type of material that you're cutting. What I'm trying to do here is give you guys options for total peace of mind. The other thing to consider here is your budget, and if the XTool smoke and fume purifier is not inside your budget, I do have another option. So in this case, I'm using this Craftsman bucket head shop vac with an adapter for a HEPA filter. The inside of the HEPA filter that I'm using already has a liner made of activated carbon cloth, but you can buy extra cloth, you can cut it out, and you can place extra layers on the inside for more odor absorption. Now the clip you're looking at here is from a previous video that I did with a different shop vac, but the concept is the same. On my website, I offer these adapters that go on either side of the filter. All of my adapters are designed to fit the same model of air purifier filter, which is very common and very popular. And once you remove the ball cage from the bottom of your shop vac, the whole assembly just snaps into place. And in this case, with this Craftsman bucket head vac, the original pre-filter fits directly on top, and you can use the original elastic band to secure the pre-filter in place. And if you haven't caught on already, it's called a bucket head shop vac because it fits onto a common 5-gallon bucket. These have become my favorite sources of suction for DIY fume extraction. Now, to get this solution to suck fumes from the XTool F1, I have an adapter that goes on the inlet of the vacuum and it interfaces with the XTool flexible hose. The other end of the XTool flexible hose would go to the back of the F1 in the same manner as was done with the XTool smoke purifier. On the outlet of the vacuum, we have an adapter to a 4-inch hose, and this is going to perform the same function that I had just described with the XTool smoke purifier, and so we're basically going to route any exhaust fumes out a window or door. Even though I'm using the filtration system, anytime you have the opportunity to get those exhaust fumes right outside, it's much better than having that air recirculated inside of your room that you're working in. You can find all of these adapters and more in the fume extraction section of my website. Before talking about fume filtration, we had left off gluing up our custom fixture for batch processing these metal USB thumb drives. If you've never done it before, batch processing is a smart way to increase efficiency when using your laser cutter and engraver. When processing a batch of identical parts, what I like to do is bring in the cutting file that I used to cut the template that's holding each of those parts. So in this case, this is the cutting file that I used for creating that jig. And when I created this cutting file, I knew that this jig would sit in the bottom pocket of the XTool F1, and so the outline corresponds with the exact outline, so size, shape, and position of that bottom aluminum plate. And therefore you can see that my square with the rounded corners is centered in my workspace, and that's exactly where that aluminum plate would be. And as with all of my other templates, I've told XTool Creative Space to ignore it, and then what I've done is I've brought in my pattern of logos that I wish to mark onto those USB sticks. To create a pattern of logos in a single file that line up perfectly with the cutting template, you could use Adobe Illustrator or even Inkscape, which is free. And many of these programs allow you to create instances of objects at specified distances, so you're not manually positioning each one, and you get a very accurate result. Then I set the thickness to 1.5 millimeters, and although the USB sticks are thicker than 1.5 millimeters, the jig sits inside of that pocket, and so it sits deeper than where the top of the plate would normally be. And so the USB sticks are only sticking up 1.5 millimeters above the zero plane, so basically the top of the normal work surface. After that, of course, I'll enter in my engraving settings, and you never want to start off with a batch if you're working with a new material. You don't want to waste 8 USB sticks all at once. I experimented with a single USB stick a few times, and I ended up with a dot duration of 300 microseconds, power at 65%, and then I also changed the DPI to 700. These settings are all with the IR laser, and I'm just going to go ahead and assume that these metal USB sticks are aluminum, and they're definitely not steel or stainless steel. Then we're ready to process the job, and obviously doing 8 USB sticks simultaneously will save us a whole bunch of time in setup. And in this case, the whole job was done in just under 4 minutes. And for the most part, it looked pretty good, except for those top 2 USB sticks, and you can see up at the very top, the logos came out a little bit light. Now, thankfully, there is an explanation for this, and it's actually right on the XTool website. And so what's happening here is that when you're using the IR laser, it takes a certain period of time to warm up, and it's even worse if you're working in a cold environment. The F1 seems to process the job from top to bottom, and so it makes sense that while at the top, the IR laser is still warming up and those logos came out a little bit light. Earlier in the video, when processing the pendant necklaces, I showed you that you can hop into the XTool settings and you can select the infrared ray preheat, and you can turn that on, and before the job starts, it'll preheat the infrared laser for 10 seconds, so you don't end up with this issue. And I'm just mentioning again here because this is a long video and you guys have likely skipped over certain parts. Luckily, the XTool F1 is a pretty low maintenance machine. However, every once in a while, it's a good idea to clean your lens with the included lens cleaning cloth. Another thing to look out for is a sticking lid, and if you find that the front lid is not operating as smooth as usual, you can just apply some of the included lubricant to the track, and that should take care of it. And if you have the smoke and fume extractor, you'll eventually need to replace the pre-filter. You can see the condition of your pre-filter by lifting off the top cover, and the pre-filter simply just pulls right out, and you can replace it with one of the 2 spares that come with the smoke and fume purifier. With enough use, eventually the entire filter pack will need to be replaced. The filter packs lift up and out, and then you can just drop a new one in, and it's really that easy. Using some of the techniques and methods that I showed you guys in this video, we're going to complete a small mini project here. First, I cut a wooden disc with about 110mm outer diameter, and then I engraved a circular pattern with the same 110mm outer diameter and a 95mm inner diameter, and then I cut that out. Then I cut out a pair of these wooden brackets which slot together to form an easel style stand. I spray painted the center of that wooden disc that we cut out earlier, and then we're going to engrave a clock face onto that green painted surface. I purposely avoided painting the outside of that disc because we're going to be applying some wood glue to glue together the clock face and the engraved ring. Then I'll place some weights on top and let that glue dry. Then we're going to take a dollar store clock and pull off all of the hands because we want to remove the clock movement from the back. When we remove those hands, you're going to want to make sure that they're all pointing up at the 12 so that when we go to put them back on, they all end up in the proper position. You can see that I've also drawn an alignment line across the back of the clock face so that we can line up the movement. Now we're going to put all of the hands back on, again, all pointing towards the 12. And on most of these cheap clocks, the hands just simply pull off and push back on. Just be sure not to pull or push too hard. Then once I'm done here, carefully replacing all of the hands, we can flip the clock over, and you'll find that we can just insert a single AA battery and the clock will start up immediately. Then you can go ahead and set the time, place the clock in its easel stand, and find a nice place to display it. Now obviously this is just a very simple clock project, but it's an example of some of the cool things you can do with the XTool F1. Before we get into the review and discussion of the F1, I do want to mention that XTool also sent me the slide extension, plus I have the RA2 rotary module from the XTool D1 Pro, both of which are compatible with the F1, but in the interest of keeping this video a little more manageable, it's getting pretty long, I'm going to cover those in a separate video. And so you guys don't miss that video, I'd really love if you hit that subscribe button down below right now. So now let's briefly discuss my overall thoughts and opinions on the XTool F1. And the first thing I'd like to imagine is who is this most suitable for? And I think it's quite good for both beginners and advanced users. I think both will find a lot of value in this machine, but for different reasons. For beginner users, it's very easy to get started with, and it's a great way to get your hands dirty and get started with laser cutting and engraving, perhaps start your first small business. And for more advanced users who probably already have a collection of laser cutters and engravers, most likely ones with larger working areas, the F1 is a nice way to supplement those larger machines so that when you have smaller jobs to process, you're not interrupting your workflow with your larger machines. And speaking of working area, one of the limitations of the XTool F1 is obviously the processing area of this machine. It's quite small. Now, that's obviously something that you have to evaluate for your use cases and what you plan on processing in this machine, and if that's going to be right for you. Now, one of the things I notice is that even with myself, I do own a few larger machines, but 90% of the time, most of that workspace is going unused. And so if you have a machine that's sitting there taking up valuable space in your workshop or in your office or wherever you're keeping this thing, and most of that space is going unused, perhaps you want to consider something smaller like the XTool F1. Now keep in mind, if you do want to work with larger workpieces with the F1, you can remove that bottom plate and you can actually physically lift and move the F1 around because it is portable and place it on a large workpiece and laser right through the hole in the bottom of the frame. And it's an interesting way of working with larger workpieces. Now obviously this doesn't increase your workable area, but what it does do is allow you to engrave smaller sections of larger workpieces. Another thing I really like is the enclosed design. It feels inherently safer than open frame laser cutters and engravers, and it makes the smoke and fumes a lot easier to deal with, especially with the smoke and fume purifier, which syncs up with the XTool F1, which is also a really nice feature. And the fit and finish, the materials is quite nice on the F1, along with the glowing logo in the front, and just the overall look. It feels like a very premium product, which is pretty consistent with everything else I've tested from XTool. In terms of software, I do actually really like the XTool Creative Space software. They're constantly updating it, and it's probably never going to be as powerful as Lightburn, but that's okay, because for somebody like me, at least 90% of what I do, I don't need all of those advanced features of Lightburn. Sure, they're nice to have, and obviously there's tons of advanced users out there who are going to make use of them. But I just find that with Creative Space, it's easy to get started, and it's just less overwhelming to operate. But of course, the nice thing is that the F1, along with all of the other XTool products, are compatible with Lightburn. So if you are one of those advanced users, you can hop into Lightburn and you'll have no problem getting it working with the XTool F1. While we're on the topic of software, one of the things that I think could be improved are the XTool reference settings. And despite using some of their XTool official materials, I found those settings to be a little off. And I had to do quite a bit of experimentation in order to get the correct settings. But of course, I provided you guys with my settings, and hopefully that gives you guys a better starting point. Since then, I did get in touch with the XTool support team, and I told them about my experience with those settings. So they said they would review them, and hopefully by the time this video gets released, they've changed them. So that's it. You've made it to the end of this very long video. Be sure to check the video description down below, where you'll find links to everything we discussed, and I would really appreciate it if you visited my website, embracemaking.com, to help support me and my work. And that's where you're gonna find things like those digital templates, fixtures, as well as these awesome laser safety glasses that I have to offer to you guys. And be sure to check out XTool. I've now tested the D1 Pro and their XTool F1, obviously in this video here. And both of them I've had very positive experiences with, so they come highly recommended. Thanks for watching.